And now our speaker, and I'm just going to introduce him quickly. Eran Kaplan is the Rhoda and Richard Goodman Chair in Israel Studies at San Francisco State University. He received his BA magna cum laude from Tel Aviv University and his PhD from Brandeis University. Before coming to San Francisco, he taught at Princeton, Cincinnati, and Toronto. He's the author of several books, including The Origins of Israel, a documentary history, and a relatively new book, Projecting the Nation, History and Ideology on the Israeli Scene. He teaches a variety of courses: Modern Israel, the Arab-Israeli Conflict, Israeli Cinema, the History of Jerusalem, and we're planning for him to talk later in the program year on something called 1968, the year after, and how the 1960 war impacted Israel, both militarily, geographically, economically, and through its politics. And now it is our great privilege to have one of our favorite speakers, Eran Kaplan.
Viva, thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you so much for asking me to speak in conjunction with this really incredible documentary film that I hope all of you have a chance to watch after Munich, if only for one of the characters that we see throughout the film, Anki Spitzer. She lost her husband in the massacre, and she is just an incredible woman, and she comes across so powerfully. So only if you get a chance to see her, it's worth your while, the 75 minutes of this film. But I want to start at the very end with what happened 3 days ago. So 3 days ago was the 50th anniversary of the massacre of the Israeli athletes, coaches, and referees who were massacred during the Olympic Games in Munich. And for the first time, there was a ceremony to commemorate the massacre in Germany. And some of the surviving families, including Anki Spitzer, participated in the ceremony. The Israeli president, Herzog, was there, as was the German president. But what facilitated and allowed the event to take place is that the German government reached an agreement with the families of the survivors and those who were killed in the massacre to compensate them financially for the loss, and an agreement was signed. So the German government will pay 28 million euros in compensation to the families. But the German government, being the German government, they negotiated basically till the last moment, this agreement. So things were up in the air. However, the demands of the families from the Germans do not stop here, because there are many files and documents that the German government have yet to release relating to the massacre, to the intelligence surrounding the massacre, and the actions of the German government during the Olympics, and then in the aftermath of the massacre as well. And I will allude to some of the issues that remain outstanding later on in my talk with you today. So I am by profession a historian. So what I will try to do here is provide as much of a historical background and context as possible to the events that took place in September of 1972 in Munich, the events leading up to it, but also the events that unfolded in the aftermath of the massacre. And I really want to start all the way back in the 1930s. So in the 1930s, the Palestinian Arabs in what was then mandatory Palestine launched a revolt against the British and the Jewish community in Palestine. This came to be known as the Great Arab Revolt in Palestine. And they were led by Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was the leader of the Palestinian community at that time, and the Arab High Commission, which was kind of a council of local Arab leaders in Palestine. And they were really behind the general Arab strike and the violence that they launched against both British and Jewish targets in Palestine. In many ways, this was the high mark of kind of independent Arab Palestinian leadership in Palestine. But as a result of the rebellion, the Palestinian leadership suffered mightily at the hands of the British authorities. Many of the Palestinian leaders were apprehended, were jailed, many of them were killed, and many of them were exiled, including Haj Amin al-Husseini. So much so that by 1939, when the rebellion came to an end, there was any serious form of local Palestinian Arab leadership in Palestine itself. They were pretty much decimated. And from that point onward, for about the next 30 years, whenever the question of Palestine, and later on the Palestinian Arabs, would come before the international community, it would be the various Arab countries who were speaking on behalf of the Arabs of Palestine. And by 1946, it would be the Arab League who would do that, whereas the Palestinians themselves did not really have any form of cohesion, leadership, or a recognized body that would represent them on the international scene. And soon I will explain why this is relevant here. So, for example, when the UN explored various solutions to the question of Palestine in 1947, with regard to the end of the British mandate, when they came to spoke to the Jewish community in Palestine, they spoke to the Zionist leadership, to the Jewish Agency and the Vaad Leumi, and they represented the Jewish community. But when they spoke to the Arabs, they really spoke to the Arab League and the various Arab leaders in the region, who in many ways spoke on behalf of the local Palestinians in Palestine. Later on, when the 7 Arab countries invaded Israel after the creation of the state in May of 1948, again, by judging backwards and understanding the maneuvers and developments in the war, it is fairly clear that they did not necessarily have in mind the welfare or well-being of the local Arab population in Palestine or the interests of the Palestinians. They were much more interested in their own national interests, goals, tactics, and achievements in the war, something that ultimately led to their collective defeat, among other things, at the hands of the IDF. But what I want to emphasize here is that from the very beginning, there were very tense relationship between some of the Arab countries and the Arab Palestinians. And the most complicated relationship was with the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. And this already ties us much, much closer to the issues leading up to 1972. So a little bit of a history here. When the British took control of the Middle East after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, they created various mandates and entities that were part of the British Empire. One of them was Palestine, which was designated as a future Jewish national home. But they also created Transjordan and Iraq. And in those two entities, they put in place the 2 sons of the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, who was deposed from Mecca by the House of Saud, and he was loyal to the British. So they instilled both his sons as future regents, future kings of Jordan and Iraq. And in Jordan, they put in place Abdallah, one of his sons, Abdallah bin Hussein. Now, Abdallah was a foreigner. He came from Mecca, from Saudi Arabia, but he was installed by the British as a leader in Amman, in Jordan. So from the very beginning, the majority of the local population, which wasn't very big, viewed him as a foreign puppet of the British Empire and not necessarily as an authentic local leader. And this was especially true of the local kind of urban, rural, non-Bedouin population, which would be under the general umbrella of the Palestinian people, who always viewed the Hashemite royal family as foreigners. And there were tense relations between the Hashemites and the local population from the very beginning, and also cooperation between the Hashemites and the Zionists from the very beginning on a host of issues. During the War of 1948, we know that there were arrangements and agreements between the Zionist leadership and King Abdallah, that they promised not to attack each other. And Israel basically ceded what came to be known as the West Bank to Abdallah, because Israel preferred Jordanian rule there over an independent Arab entity, not that any Arab entity was created in 1948 at all. And then Abdallah ruled over a fairly large Palestinian population, both in the West Bank, but also refugee camps inside of Jordan itself. And the tensions between the Palestinians and the Hashemite family escalated. And in 1951, Abdallah was assassinated at the entrance to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the old city of Jerusalem by a Palestinian assassin. Miraculously, the kingdom survived. Abdallah's son Talal was mentally ill, so he had to be succeeded by his grandson Hussein, who was 16 at the time. So he served as regent for 2 years and then became king of the Hashemite kingdom. All throughout this time, there was a large Palestinian population living under Jordanian rule, whether in the West Bank or in Jordan proper. And some of those Palestinians began to engage in what was known at the time as Faddayin activities, guerrilla activities or terrorist activities aimed at Israel. This involved mainly crossing the border into Israel, trying to plant bombs or attack Israeli civilians. And we know for a fact that the Jordanian government, the house, the palace and the Jordanian military were very uneasy with those activities because they feared that if the Palestinians would amass power in Jordan, this would undermine the kingdom and might lead to its dissolution. So we have many indications of various cooperations between the Jordanian monarchy and Israel over that time for over security issues. But things would change dramatically in the aftermath of the 1967 war. At this point, Israel gains control of the West Bank, including all the Palestinian population in its midst. And Israel launches a whole series of operations and creates a whole policy to make sure that the Palestinian organizations cannot establish a stronghold in the West Bank and threaten Israel from there. At this point, new Palestinian organizations come to the front, and the PLO, which in 1964 was created by the Arab League as kind of a puppet organization of the Arab League, Yasser Arafat and Fatah take control over the PLO and come to dominate it. And they declare Palestinian independence in 1968 and declare war on Israel. And they use Jordan and the Hashemite kingdom as their base of operation. So they build military bases in Jordan and they launch operation from Jordanian territory against Israeli targets. Again, much to the dismay of King Hussein and the Jordanian military. At this point, I would like to show you a document from 1968 that's going to be very relevant to our discussion. And this is the Palestinian National Charter, which was published in 1968 by the PLO and Yasser Arafat. And it says that Palestine is the homeland of the Arab Palestinian people, and you cannot divide it. And it rejects any kind of compromise with Israel. It calls for the creation of a Palestinian Arab state over the entire area of what was mandatory Palestine. It declares who are Palestinians, Arab nationals who resided in Palestine in 1947, and then their descendants, or Jews who resided there before the Zionist invasion, as they call it right here. But then they go on to say the following things. In Article 8, they say the following: the phase in their history through which the Palestinian people are now living is that of national struggle for the liberation of Palestine. Basically, they're saying we are now in a state of war against the Zionists, against Israel. Then they go on to say armed struggle is the only way to liberate Palestine. This is the overall strategy, not merely a tactical phase. Again, a full-out declaration of war against Israel. But then in Article 10, they're saying the following: commando action constitutes the nucleus of the Palestinian Popular Liberation War. This requires its escalation, comprehensiveness, and the mobilization of all Palestinian popular and educational efforts and their organization. So it's an all-out war against Israel, but they realize that they don't have the type of military or infrastructure to go to a conventional war against Israel, especially not in the aftermath of the 1967 defeat of the Arab armies. So they're basically saying this is going to be a commando war. and we're going to use commando tactics. One other thing that I would like to emphasize is Article 22 of the Palestinian National Charter, which says the following: Zionism is a political movement organically associated with international imperialism and antagonistic to all action for liberation and to progressive movements in the world. It's racist and fanatic and so on and so forth. Israel is a constant source of threat vis-a-vis peace in the Middle East, and they look for the support of all the progressive and peaceful forces and urge them all to join in the Palestinian struggle for independence. And this really creates the blueprint of how Arafat and the PLO envisioned the struggle from 1968 going forward. What they called commando attacks, and of course what Israel and the West called terrorist attacks at various Israeli targets all over the world. But also they wanted to internationalize the conflict with Israel. And that meant two things. One, not just focus on Israel itself, but on Israeli targets all over the world. So television screens all over the world will show the Palestinian struggle and give it a major international echo and recognition, but also to cooperate with other movements around the world that will be sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. And they started establishing connections, for example, with the IRA in Ireland. And they offered the IRA to train in the military bases of the PLO in Jordan. The newly formed Red Army faction in Germany started to cooperate with the PLO in those years. So did the Red Army brigades in Italy and the Japanese Red Army as well. So all those connections were made, and the PLO began a series of operations and attacks aimed at internationalizing the conflict and creating kind of an international buzz around the Palestinian cause. And in 1968, they hijacked the first Israeli plane, an El Al flight from Europe going to Tel Aviv. And eventually the plane landed in Algeria. The non-Jewish passengers were separated from the Jewish passengers and were released. Then the Jewish and Israeli passengers were held in a house in Algeria for 3 weeks. But then there was international pressure on the Algerian government. So the International Organization of Pilots refused to fly to Algeria and from Algeria. Other governments put pressure. So the Algerian government ordered the release of all the hostages. And none of the demands of the hijackers were met. This was, by the way, the last time that an El Al flight was successfully hijacked by Arab or other terrorists. But this did not stop there. One other very important event took place in 1968. After a series of attacks on towns in northern Israel by PLO fighters who crossed over from Jordan, from across the border, Israel decided to retaliate. And they identified the village of Karame, which was just over the border from Israel, as the headquarters for many of the operations of PLO. And there was some indications that Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO, may have been in the village as well. So Israeli ground forces and or air forces launched an attack against the refugee camp in Karame, which was really a training post for the PLO and a base of operation. Eventually, the Israeli forces were able to destroy much of the camp and kill 140 PLO operatives. However, they met fierce resistance, both by the PLO, but also by the Jordanian military that was very upset that they were not informed of the operation. And so the Jordanian military sent units, and several Israeli soldiers were killed. several Israeli tanks and armored vehicles were apprehended and eventually paraded in Amman. And the PLO was able to sell the outcome of Karame as a victory for the PLO. And this gave them so much energy and motivation that Arafat was contemplating a coup inside of Jordan and throwing away the king and basically establishing a Palestinian state inside of Jordan. At this point, Hussein was very much alarmed. And in 1970, things will unfold quickly. In early September of 1970, Palestinians and sympathizers from other countries hijacked 5 planes, including 2 Israeli planes. In one of the Israeli planes, 2 planes that left from Israel, the pilots were able to take control of the situation and apprehend the hijackers, including Layla Khaled, which was in one of those planes. But 3 of the planes were they landed in a Jordanian airport, Dawson Airport in Zalka in northern Jordan. And from there, the PLO started to negotiate with Israel and the international community and made demands. And eventually, they blew up those planes, which belonged to various foreign airline companies on the tarmac in the airport. And this was the breaking point for King Hussein of Jordan. And he basically launched a war against the PLO in Jordan to kick them out of the kingdom. In Palestinian lore, this came to be known as the Black September, when King Hussein launched a war against the PLO. And at some point, the Syrian army intervened on behalf of the PLO. At this point, we know that King Hussein asked Israel for assistance. He wanted Israel to bomb targets. Israel refused to do that. But the thing that Israel did do was to fly Israeli jets along the Syrian-Jordanian border in order to prevent Syrian forces from crossing over to Jordan. And eventually, the operation was successful, and the PLO was kicked out of Jordan. And it's moved its operations to Lebanon. So the political leadership of the PLO moved to Lebanon, and southern Lebanon became the military bases of the PLO, from which it would launch many attacks against Israel, as we will know later on, and this would culminate in the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon. But in retaliation for the events that happened, the Palestinians, the PLO, created the Black September organization. And it sought to avenge the events that led up to September 1970 and carry out revenge operations against Israel. And Black September also created alliances with various organizations around the world. And when we think of 1972, we think of the Munich Olympic massacre, but this was not the only terrorist attack in 1972 on the international scene. In early May of 1972, members of Black September hijacked a Sabina, the Belgian company, flight from Brussels via Vienna to Tel Aviv. The plane landed in Lod, in the international airport in Israel. But in there, the terrorists laid out a series of demands, mainly the release of Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails. The Israeli government, the policy has always been never to negotiate with the terrorists, with the hostage takers. And Israel deployed Sayeret Matkal, that's the elite commando unit in Israel. At the time, the commander was Ehud Barak, later Prime Minister of Israel, and he and his lieutenant, Dani Yatom, dressed up as mechanics who went to inspect the plane on the tarmac in Lod, and other members of the unit dressed up as workers in the airport, and they were able to overtake the terrorists and release all the hostages unharmed in the airport in Israel. We'll get to that in a few minutes. But this was not the only attack in May of 1972. Later on that month, a group of members of the Japanese Red Army who were cooperating with the Black September organization, boarded a flight from Athens to Tel Aviv. And when they landed in Israel, they opened fire in the terminal, killing 28 people. They were led by Kozo Akimoto. He was the leader of that group, and he was apprehended and served the next 13 years in an Israeli jail. So there was a series of events and attacks already in 1972. So the events in the Olympics were not isolated. But of course, they grabbed the international headlines because it was the Olympic Games, which were broadcast live all over the world. And again, it was Black September, which was really a code name, but they were part of the PLO under the leadership of Ali Hassan Salameh, who planned the attack against the Israeli athletes and coaches in the Olympics in Munich. What we do know now, and there were publications in Germany and some files were revealed, is that the German authorities had information that the Palestinians were planning something. We know that the telegram was sent from the German embassy in Beirut to the government in Bonn a few weeks before the games, warning that something was being planned. But the German government ignored. The Israeli government also had some information, and they related to the Germans. And in fact, the head of the Israeli delegation to the Olympic Games, a person by the name of Lalkin, was very worried by the lack of security and the fact that the Israeli delegation was not accompanied by Israeli security guards going to the Olympic Games. But it was very important for the Israeli government at the time to cooperate with the German government. For the Germans, these were symbolic games. This was the antidote to the Olympic Games of '36. They wanted to show to the world that this was the new Germany, that this was a new beginning for Germany, to erase the legacies of the past. So unlike the '36 Olympics, where the Nazi army was on full display and Nazi militarism on full display, they wanted to show these as the peaceful Olympics and hide any presence of security or military. And they conveyed this message to the Israeli government, and ultimately the Israeli government wanted to cooperate and support the German efforts. So we do know that the Israelis were aware of certain things, but they decided to trust the German authorities and go along. But then, of course, on the night of September 4th, 1972, 8 Palestinian terrorists dressed in tracksuits, pretending to be athletes, entered the Olympic Village. But not only did they enter the Olympic Village, apparently they had stolen keys to the building where the Israeli athletes resided and to some of the rooms in that building, which is a clear indication that there was a lot of planning involved in the lead up to this attack. And we think that there were 2 sources or 2 groups that probably helped the Palestinians. One, neo-Nazis on the ground in Germany who supported them, but also the Red Brigades, the Red Army faction, the Baader-Meinhof group, were also cooperating and assisting the Palestinians on the ground. And very easily, they marched into the building where the Israeli athletes and coaches were staying. They knew exactly what the first room was, but they encountered there Moshe Weinberg, who was the coach of the Israeli wrestling team, a person who weighed 300 pounds and was very, very strong. And he actually battled the Palestinian terrorists and fought them physically, but they subdued him and injured him. They shot him once and asked him to lead him to the other rooms. He told them that in the next room, there were athletes from a different country, and thereby saving the lives of several Israeli athletes who were in that room. But he led them to another room where members of the weightlifting and the wrestling teams were. And we can only assume that he believed that these were powerful men who might be able to engage in some kind of physical fight against the terrorists. And by reconstructing some of the events, he was probably right. Because when they entered the room, the Josefo Romano, who was the coach of the wrestling team, joined Weinberg, and they together tried to jump and fight the terrorists. But at this point, both of them were shot and they were killed on the spot. And for the next several hours, the 8 terrorists would hold the hostages in the room, and they started making demands. Some of the demands were to release over 200 Palestinian prisoners in jails in Israel, but also the leaders of the Red Army faction in Germany. This was also part of their demand. And at this point, the German authorities did every possible mistake in the book. We know, and I just saw an interview with Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister, who was the head of Sayed Matkal, who headed the operation that released the passengers of the Sabena plane in Lod. And he asked Moshe Dayan, the defense minister, put me on a plane right now, let me handle the situation in Munich. And Dayan told him, I can't fly you there. Not only can I not send you, but the Germans cannot send their own military to handle the situation because of the federal constitution in Germany. Only the local Bavarian and Munich police can engage under German federal law. And the indication came very quickly that the Germans were not going to bend the rules, and they were not going to send their military to deal with the situation. So instead, they sent the local police, which was ill-equipped and absolutely had no idea what they were doing. The negotiations were as follows. The terrorists demanded that a plane will take them to Cairo. From there, they will use the hostages in order to negotiate further demands. The Germans were able to convince them not to use the Munich International Airport, but to use a military base operated by NATO. And they said, we will fly you with 2 helicopters from the Olympic Village to this airport. There'll be a plane waiting for you, and it will take you to Cairo. The initial plan was to follow the model set by the Israelis in Lod in May of 1972, to have German police and military disguised as pilots and operators of the flight on the plane to wait for the terrorists there and then try to take them out as they boarded the plane. However, the Germans refused to go ahead. They said it was too dangerous and it'll put German lives in danger. So this part of the operation was called off. Instead, the local police sent 5 snipers to the airbase to take down the officers. At this point, we're talking about estimated arrival time of 10:30 p.m. at the airport. This is nighttime. So they wanted snipers at night to take out the terrorists and release the passengers. Not the most thought out plan. At some point, they decided to send armored cars to the airport, but they got stuck in traffic. I kid you not. This also happened. As a result, the helicopters landed. After they landed, suddenly the armored cars arrived. At that point, the terrorists panicked. They opened fire. Then the German police retaliated. All 9 hostages, remaining hostages, were killed in the airport. 5 of the 8 terrorists were killed, and 1 West German police officer was killed as well. And thus came the end of this very, very tragic development, but not the end of the story. There were debates on whether to stop the Olympic Games, halt them, or continue. And there the Germans pressured to go ahead as if almost nothing happened, without almost mentioning what happened to the Israeli athletes and the Israeli delegation. They were so keen in continuing to show the world that they can carry out an international event. And the Olympic Games continued. there's an incredible scene in the movie where Esther Roth, the Israeli sprinter, who her coach was killed in the massacre, she was asked by the Germans to compete in the final after the massacre, to which meant, and she, of course, couldn't do it because she was devastated and could not go on. But at this point, we have 3 terrorists who are now held by the German authorities, and Israel begins to take measures. On September 8th, Israel launched aerial attacks against PLO bases in both Lebanon and Syria, killing an estimated 200 PLO members in those attacks. But then Golda Meir thought that this might be enough, this initial retaliation. But then a month after the Olympic Games, the PLO hijacked a Lufthansa plane. And part of the demands was the release of the 3 terrorists. And the German government released them. And all 3 of them died of natural causes. So they lived out the rest of their life in various Arab countries after their release. And at this point, Israel decided to carry out more targeted operations against the infrastructure of the PLO in Europe and against some of those who were behind the massacre. This came to be popularly known as the Operation Wrath of God. And there were various authors and journalists who used the name. Members of Mossad who went on the record say that this is complete fabrication, that the Mossad never used this name. But we can do whatever we want with this information. But there were various targets that Israel gathered throughout Europe, and they carried out assassinations of various people associated with the PLO, but especially those who were in positions of organizing connections between the PLO and various groups in Europe and student organizations and others. And this is really the point, that we should not think of this operation as vengeance, because as Tzvi Zamir himself said on several occasions, he was the head of the Mossad at that time, the 3 remaining terrorists, Israel never tried to take them out. Israel was more interested in undermining the ability of future such attacks, and these were the targets. And Israel carried some very daring operations as part of the events that unfolded after Munich. For example, in 1973, it carried out Operation Aviv Neurim, Youth of Spring, whereby Sayed Matkal, including Ehud Barak, and 2 other commando units were dispatched by boats into Beirut. Many of them were dressed in civilian clothes, some were dressed as women, and they targeted several PLO leaders and killed them in Beirut. And the commando unit of the Israeli paratroopers attacked a building that served as one of the headquarters of the PLO in Beirut and basically destroyed that building. And all but 2 of the Israeli soldiers returned alive from this operation. 2 were killed, but this was one of the most daring attacks in broad daylight in Beirut in retaliation to what happened in Munich in 1972. But the biggest target, and here clearly there was an element of vengeance, was Ali Hassan Salameh, the head of Black September and the planner of the massacre in 1972. And he was in Beirut, and Israel had a very hard time getting to him. And there are 2 journalists whom I trust, David Ignatius, who writes for the Washington Post, and Ronen Bergman, who writes for the Yediot Achronot, and both of them claim that Ali Hassan Salameh struck a deal with the CIA in Beirut. That he basically told the CIA, I will provide protection to American targets in Beirut, the American University, the American Embassy, and other. In return, you keep me safe. Again, this is their research, these are their findings, but it would make sense because he was able to survive several attempts until 1979. By 1979, the Mossad had some good information of where Ali Hassan Salameh was staying. At this time, he was probably feeling a little too secure and too confident in his ability to survive. And two operatives planted about 300 kilos of TNT in a car on a street in Beirut, and they knew that his car would be passing by, and as soon as it came by, they blew up that car, and Ali Hassan Salameh was killed in 1979, and to a large degree, this ended this series of operations that unfolded in the aftermath of the 1972 massacre in Munich. And from that point onward, it was really the struggle of the survivors, the families, and Anki Spitzer, as you will see in the movie, to demand more information, more transparency from the German government. Again, I don't want to end this on a downer, but one of the pieces of the information that finally the Germans revealed was that the two Israeli, the athlete and the coach, were killed immediately when the hostages were taken, that the terrorists mutilated the corpses in the rooms. And the Germans kept that a secret for 20 years, this fact. And eventually they told it to the widow of the coach who was killed in that room on the night of September 4th, 1972. So at this point, really, the only remaining legacy is to come up with more information and more truth regarding those events. And I will end here and be very happy to answer any questions or react to any comments.
So everyone, I'm sure there must be questions, so please put them in the chat function. I lived in Israel in the 70s, and my husband was studying at Weizmann Institute of Science, and the president was at the Lud he was killed at the Lud attack. And his brother, just to give background, later became president of Israel. I certainly remember that. I could ask you about something while we wait for other questions. Oh, here. There was an American, someone writes, there was an American killed. Could you comment on that?
Yes, one of the members of the Israeli delegation had a dual citizenship, Israeli and American. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And did America react in any way, since he was also American?
He was also American, but again, the American delegation did not withdraw from the games. They went on and participated. So they condemned were Stasi and KGB involved. We can only assume that yes. And in fact, some of the targets later on of the Israeli assassinations in Europe were of PLO operatives who maintained relationship with the KGB in Europe.
Okay, I didn't know that. While we're waiting for more questions, I like you mentioned the Sayeret Matkal, the Special Elite Forces, which Ehud Barak was on. Last summer, I read this book. I don't know if you've read it.
The title?
It's called Entebbe Declassified.
Okay.
And that unit, that Special Elite unit, which often is in the shadows, but sometimes comes out, and people write about it, especially retired members. Yonatan Netanyahu was one of the leaders of it and was the leader at Entebbe. And this book, I'm just, in case people are more interested in this, then we'll go back to other questions. There's a controversy in Israel, and it's dealt with this book, was Netanyahu, Yonatan, the brother who died at Entebbe, Africa, was he going to be dismissed because people didn't think he was up to it? Because there was a guy named, I think, Belzer, who was also in the unit and claims after Yonatan was killed that he really was the real leader and Yonatan was on his way out.
Yes. This has to do with the 1973 Yom Kippur War. so at the beginning, early phases of the war, the Syrian forces were able to retake parts of the Golan Heights and Mount Hermon. Now, Sayed Matkal, this commando unit, in a regular war, they don't really have much of a role. They're for special operations. And at some point, they asked to participate in the battle for Hermon, to retake Hermon Mountain. And there, Yoni Netanyahu decided not to follow the general orders of the battle, but because he led a commando unit to enter Syrian territory and attack the Syrians from the rear, which sounded good on paper, but unfolded in ways that put some members of the unit in jeopardy, and a few members were injured and killed, and this led to a minor rebellion against him within the unit. People felt that he disobeyed orders and undermined some of the chain of command within the IDF. So these are some of the issues that led some people to question him, yeah. But this is kind of inside baseball of Sayed Matkal, inside baseball, yeah.
Another question someone writes, wasn't Avery Brundage the head of the International Olympic Committee in charge? I don't mean he was a German, but that he was around in 1936 when it was at Munich.
In Berlin.
Oh, sorry, Berlin. Sorry, wrong city.
I don't know. I'll have to look into it. Yeah. I will have to.
There is a lot of controversy about the Berlin Olympics. I wasn't around then, so I forgot what city. But some people, we feel, historians believe, were pressured not to actually compete there because they were Jewish, and put other people in the American Olympic team in front, not in front, but ahead of. Hi, Steve. You want to say something? Go ahead.
Well, that would have been Avery Brundage.
Yeah. So there's controversy about him, and that he is allegedly or was anti-Semitic.
Could very well be. Yeah.
And okay.
He was also involved in taking Jim Thorpe's medals away. A terrible record.
Okay.
Someone asked, why didn't the Germans do more? I think you said because there was federal statutes.
That's on one level. But then also they decided midway through the operation that they didn't want to put their personnel at risk, for example, on the plane. So they simply carry out that part of the operation.
Do you think that if Barak had gotten there with a crew of elite forces that they could have done more, or because there was no plan, there was absolutely no planning, and the Germans would not, give them, probably building plans or any help, that they could have done something, or was that wishful thinking?
If they were allowed to operate, again, the Israeli government was not going to send a unit into Germany and violate German sovereignty, German law. The relationship between Israel and Germany was a very complicated one and very delicate one. But again, it's all hindsight. But it seemed that there were many opportunities where the terrorists could have been overtaken by a resolute military operation, which the Germans simply didn't carry out. Spreading 5 snipers with ill-equipped material in the middle of the night was just ridiculous. But they had to march from the helicopters to the plane. They were wide open on the tarmac. You could have done so many things there with minimal preparation, which the Germans didn't do because they didn't have the units and they didn't have the whereabouts, or who knows. But it was a tragedy all around.
If there are any more questions, a bit of trivia. Going back to 1972 and the Sabina hijacking, and I never knew Sabina didn't have as much security because they had a student rate. And as a student at the time with my husband at Weizmann, we could get a cheap fare to go back to visit our parents. So I used to fly Sabina all the time. But the captain of the Sabina plane was actually a British Jew.
Yes.
And his grandson, well, his children, at least one of them, moved to Israel. And the grandson, I knew very well because he was married to the shliach, the Tali, who served at the Jewish Federation of the East Bay as the shliach, as the emissary of the Jewish Agency.
Mhm.
So her husband was the grandson of the pilot, of the
Yep.
British pilot.
Yeah.
Okay, are there any other questions? If not, I want to thank you so much. I
Thank
want
you.
to also just mention an interesting book that we're going to have the author speak on, Coco at the Ritz. Maybe you've heard of the controversy over Coco Chanel, of the Chanel, and whether or not she was a Nazi sympathizer during World War II. So that is upcoming with our author series for Under One Tent. But the next time we're going to see everyone for the film festival is towards the end of October, when we show the documentary Upheaval about the life of Menachem Begin. And upheaval means, of course, Begin's his party getting enough seats to form a coalition. So instead of the Labor Party, which had been the party of leadership since 1948, you now have Likud. But we look forward to bringing back Professor Kaplan to talk about 1968, a year after, and all of its implications, maybe closer to the Six-Day War in the late spring. Everyone stay cool. It's very hot in Walnut Creek where I'm sitting.
Yeah.
And I wish everyone an early high holiday greeting, be healthy, peaceful, and hopefully we'll see a great number of wonderful films in the coming months.
Yeah, I just have a couple of comments.
Marian, yes.
Yes. First of all, I just found that woman, and I can't remember her name. She was just incredible. You know, the one whose husband was killed and who fought for, you know, all these
Yes.
years for the murdered Israelis. She to me was just an unbelievable, you know, what she went through, and she was not even born in Israel. And I just found that she was just such an incredible woman. And also the focus on the documentary on those two other women who were, I didn't quite get it. Were they Israeli spies or whatever? They were involved in the murder of the wrong person. And then the documentary was focusing on, you know, the rest of their lives. Do you remember, do you, you know?
Yes, if I can
speaking
just
about
say,
it?
yes, so Marian, in response to your question, yes, they were two Mossad agents.
They both
Were
were.
involved in an attempt to assassinate Ali Hassan Salameh in Lillehammer in Norway, but it was a case of mistaken identity.
Right,
It was a
right.
Moroccan waiter working there, which the Israeli intelligence thought was Ali Hassan Salameh, living under disguise. And they carried out the assassination. These two women were apprehended by Norwegian police and
Right.
served a few months in a Norwegian jail. Yep.
Right, right. And anyway, it's an incredible documentary, and thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for your
Please
insight.
let your friends know they could still register for the film, and Professor Kaplan's talk will be recorded. So if they register, they'll also get a recording of his very powerful presentation. Eran, are you saying something? No, your hand is up. No. Everyone, thank you. And again, Shana Tova, be healthy, be safe. And we have a lot of films coming up, especially for our film festival later in March. Goodbye. Shalom.
Shalom. Thank you so much, Riva.
My pleasure. Bye.